So the premise behind these talks is for some of the UW Jewish Studies faculties to really talk about something that they're doing in their courses scheduled for the coming year. The course that I'm teaching in the fall, in whatever format we happen to be teaching in then, is American Jewish Literature and Culture. And I usually begin the course with the poem that I wanted to talk about today. But to frame it a little bit for this talk, I sort of wanted to point out that there's a strong current in American Jewish culture of nostalgia for the old country. You know, we're most familiar with something like Fiddler on the Roof as being the most maybe prominent example of that. But that begins much earlier. And I wanted to play about a minute of a song that many of you will know. And I will then kind of think about how to the poem that I want to discuss today really is trying to do something different. So in 1928, there was a song that was written about a shtetl in Transnistria called Balta or Bells. And this is known to many, many people, so I'll just play about a minute.
Mein Städtele Welt, meine Heimele ich hol, meine kindrische Jugend verbracht. Sind ihr amul gewesen in Welt, meine Heimele Welt, meine Heimele ich hol, mit die Kinder dort gelacht. Jeden Schabels pfleg ich läuten dort mit dem Chemischkleid. Sitzen hinter dem kleinen Beimale, lernen bei dem Tag.
And so on, it continues. The kind of nostalgic mode, you know, presents this idyllic shtetl in the past that the speaker of the poem had left behind, and it was a place where everybody got along well, and he had spent a nice childhood there. It is really kind of prevalent in the way that a lot of American Jews continue to think about the old country. So I wanted to talk about the poet Moyshe-Leyb Halpern, who immigrates from the I guess, old country, as it were. One second, let me just play this. Slideshow. Okay, here we go. Who immigrates from his hometown of Zlochov in Galicia, which was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and comes to New York in 1908 and becomes associated with this group of modernist poets called Die Junge, or the Young, and writes this poem in 1924 that I had sent out earlier, and I'm going to read it with you now, that is really doing something very different at the same time, at roughly the same time as this kind of nostalgic poem and song about this other shtetl, Bells, was also written. So let's just read the poem quickly, and then I'll talk about a couple of things. O Zlochov, you my home, my town, with the church spire, synagogues, and bath, your women sitting in the marketplace, you little Jews breaking loose like dogs at a peasant coming down with a basket of eggs from the Sasov mountain. Like life in spring awakens in me, my poor bit of longing for you, my home, my Zlochov. But when, steeped in longing, I recall the rich man Rappaport, how he walks with his big belly to the synagogue, and Shai Hillel's the pious Jew who could sell like a pig in a sack in the sun with all its glowing, then it's enough to extinguish in me like a candle my longing for you, my home, my Zlochov. How goes the story about that dandy? Once in an evening he watched for so long the angels roaming about the sun, till a drunken peasant with an axe cut him down under his dress coat. Poor man, he almost died from that. The peasant with an axe is my hater in me, for my grandfather, and through him for you, my home, my Zlochov. Your earth may witness, I'm not making it up. When my grandfather called the police to chase my mother from his house, my grandmother, her legs spread wide, smiled almost as honey sweet as a girl standing between two soldiers. Cursed be my hatred inside me, which reminds me of her and of you, my home, my Zlochov. Like a bunch of naked Jews in a bath surrounding a man who'd been scolded, they nodded their heads and stroked their beards around the evicted packs and junk, thrown out pillows and blankets at sacks, and around the bit of broken bed. To this day, my mother is crying in me, and then under your sky, in you, my home, my Zlochov. But our world is full of wonders. A horse and a cart over the fields will carry you out to a railway train, which flies like a demon over the fields, till it brings you to a ship with a lower deck, which takes you away to your downtown. And this indeed is my only consolation, that they will not bury me in you, my home, my Zlochov. So I wanted to focus on a couple of things. One is how the poem frames the kind of conversation between the speaker of the poem and his hometown, Zlochov, by kind of evoking it. It's addressing it in second person, right? So it's you, my home, you, Zlochov. It's addressing Zlochov as though that town, the shtetl Zlochov, was itself the interlocutor. So the speaker of the poem, who is not the same person as the poet Moyshe-Leyb Halpern, some of the details that the story that are conveyed in the poem are really not biographical details about the poet. The things that the speaker describes did not happen to Moyshe-Leyb Halpern. So the speaker of the poem addresses the hometown in a way that evokes very different kinds of vignettes than this other song that I played for you in the beginning. There is no pleasant reminiscences about the hometown. Instead, there's a series of vignettes that are quite kind of brutal and not very nice and quite disturbing, in fact. So though the poem begins in a way that we might begin hearing a kind of nostalgic poem about longing, right? The poet thinks about his hometown in the first stanza, and that thought awakens in him my poor bit of longing for you, my home, my Zlochov. But then, when seeped in longing, I recall, and there begin several stanzas of these vignettes, which are presenting this kind of sarcastic, caustic, disturbing set of images and dramatis personae from his shtetl, who were not at all very nice. So he recalls a rich man who, you know, is kind of has an unpleasant appearance, and a rich pious Jew who can sell you anything like a pig in a sack, which itself is a very kind of disturbing image in a Yiddish poem, because pigs are obviously not kosher, and drunken peasants, and the speaker's grandfather who had chased away his mother for what we understand to be kind of illicit affair, the product of which is the speaker of the poem itself. And that is kind of this very anti-nostalgic move. I'm very interested in this poem in how it conveys those impressions by embodying these reminiscences in the speaker himself. So it's, you know, I recall different things he says, and every time he finishes a stanza, he talks about how all of these recollections are enough to extinguish in me my poor bit of longing, or enough to recall a hatred in me, or a hatred inside me, that all of these reminiscences that are stories, right? They're vignettes that he tells, somehow enter him in a very physical way almost, right? That he becomes so close to these negative reminiscences that they become part of his own body and his kind of gut reaction to what it is that he is experiencing and what it is that he is telling to those who hear him. And kind of another thing that is really of interest to me, and this is, the poem is in Yiddish. The translation that I read for you, that I shared with you, is by Benjamin and Barbara Harshav. And it's interesting to think about kind of how the translators choose to deal with one particular aspect of it that I think points at another interesting bit in this poem, and that's how the poem itself is thinking about nostalgia. So let me share this screen with you, and this is in the last stanza, where the poem shifts from telling us these different vignettes about the hometown to imagining something that in the context of this extremely dour and depressing poem is something like a, you know, optimistic uplift, right? That the world is full of wonders, a horse and a cart over the fields will carry you out to a railway station, which flies like a demon over the fields, till it brings you to a ship with a lower deck, which takes you away to New York downtown. And this indeed is my only consolation, that they will not bury me in you, my home, my Zlochov. The poet sees the escape, or the speaker of the poem sees the escape from Zlochov in immigration to America, which is what happened to Moyshe-Leyb Halpern himself. And that really is the only saving grace, right, about Zlochov, is that the poet or the speaker of the poem can be taken out of it. So I'm really, really interested in this line that I highlighted in yellow, and I want to talk about translation for a couple of minutes, where in the Yiddish original, what it says in kind of what I highlighted in yellow, he's imagining, you know, a ship, was can fährt rüber in New York downtown, which carries you away, which takes you away to downtown New York downtown, and the words New York downtown are in English. In the original Yiddish of the poem, right, the word downtown is spelled out as the English word downtown. So the translators in this English translation, Benjamin and Barbara Harshav, treat it as one word, New York downtown. They treat it as a kind of incongruous construct. And I'm really struck by what that is, and kind of that emotional center of the poem, that suggests perhaps that the poet or the speaker of the poem is imagining himself back in Zlochov, back in his hometown, before he left it, as he was imagining going to some place called New York downtown that he's heard about from maybe other people who had gone to this place, maybe wrote letters about it back home, and those people who don't know English or didn't know English inserted that construction maybe into their letters in a way that the speaker of the poem has absorbed it without understanding what that means. So New York downtown becomes this mythic place that maybe doesn't exist outside the speaker's own imagination, takes him back to a place where in Zlochov he could still see himself as somewhat innocent about this America that he is going to, and from which he is presumably speaking now about his hometown. So I'm very interested, I'm gonna try to wrap up here, in what this poem does and how we can think about it as tapping into a kind of nostalgic desire, right? In the first stanza of the poem, owes Zlochov this direct appeal, direct address to the hometown, prompts us to expect a poem that will pleasantly recall the kind of beautiful things we're lost and left behind. In the subsequent stanzas, we're treated to a parade of horribles, so to speak, all of the things that make that hometown and the life in it quite discordant, disagreements between people, hypocrisy, disagreements, discord in families, none of the things that the song about the other kind of idyllic shtetl that I played in the beginning imagines, right? Where everybody gets along and people read and study and play together and everything is happy and bright. So it does this kind of anti-nostalgic move until the final final stanza, where it maybe allows for the possibility of some kind of optimism, of returning back to Zlochov that the poet really hates, or the speaker of the poem really hates, as a place where he could still imagine some other kind of America than the America in which maybe he ended up, right? The place, New York downtown, is a mythic place that could be envisioned but not yet experienced, and it could only be envisioned back home in Zlochov, that is otherwise a place that the speaker of the poem really dislikes. So just in conclusion, I began my courses, my Jewish American Literature course with this poem, and spend more time on this obviously than 20 minutes, to really kind of think about this strong current and countercurrent in American Jewish culture in the 20th and 21st century, where both of these currents kind of brush up against each other. This kind of strong current of nostalgia for the old country among the Ashkenazi Jews in America, and maybe attempts to imagine within American Jewish communities a kind of cohesion and cohesiveness that is identified nostalgically with kind of the Jewish community of the old country, and the countercurrent of that, the fact that that's never the case in the American Jewish experience, through much of the kind of canon of American Jewish culture. And in my course, we read things like Philip Roth stories about suburbia in post-war America, where Jews are anything but uncomfortable, but comfortable with each other and with people that they live among, and kind of how that kind of thinking goes back all the way to the early part of the 20th century. And Moyshe-Leyb Halpern's poem is a good kind of preface to that conflict. Okay, I think my time is up, and now I think is the time for questions.
Yes.
Okay.
That's right. So I'll share the Slido screen one more time just to make sure everyone got the instructions. And I'll start out with a question, Sasha, because I know you are a translator out of Yiddish as well. If there are any comments or things that you wanted to say about the translation or the languages, the way the poem sounds in Yiddish versus English.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this translation, as I read it, I try to read it in a way that shows that they try to maintain a bit of a rhythm. It's very different, obviously, from the original Yiddish, but they try to make some of the things kind of be paced in a similar way. I'm kind of interesting, I guess I'll point out a couple of things that to me are kind of really wonderful about this translation. If you look at I guess I can't figure out how to go back to my share. Actually, let me try to do that. 1 second, I'm going to share a screen again. Oh no, never mind, I can't do that. I'm not going to do that. But
Okay.
at the end of the first stanza in the English, like life in spring awakens in me, my poor bit of longing for you, my home, my Zlochov. But when seeped in longing, I recall that word longing repeats twice in the translation into English, as the root for that repeats also in the Yiddish. So the Yiddish is wie das Leben im Frühling wacht auf in mir, mein Ohren bissel Bänkschaft zu dir, mein Heim, mein Zlochov, nor as ich der Mond sich verbänkterheit. So that Bänkschaft is the word for longing in Yiddish, verbänkterheit, right? This kind of same bänken, that same root becomes part of an adverb in the Yiddish that the translators convey into the English with the word longing and the playing on the word longing. And that's really crucial to the poem, because something that I've talked about earlier in this conversation, how, there's an anticipation in the first stanza that we're going to be reading a nostalgic poem that's, full of longing. But the point is, for the speaker of the poem, that the longing kind of turns on itself. Once you start thinking about it, the mood created by that longing is the opposite of it. So that's really wonderful. And the other thing that's really interesting about this poem is that Moyshe-Leyb Halpern breaks up in the very first line the word Heimstadt, the word for hometown, which is usually, it's one word, and you think of it as one kind of construct. It's a town that is also your home, Heimstadt, hometown, the same that we do it in English. And translators treat it in the same way. They go with, oh, Zlochov, you, my home, my town. And what it does, both in Yiddish and in English, is to force us to think about home and town as two separate things, right? Where we're no longer able to accept at face value the fact that we can feel somehow, at peace with a hometown. And instead we have to think about the difference between the home and the town.
That's great. Thank you. There are some really good questions here. I think that I can combine two, and we'll have to wrap up after that. But kind of more philosophically, someone asked, for you, why is it important to challenge American Jewish nostalgia for the, quote, old country? And then along those lines, is there anything else you recommend reading or watching about this tension of imagining America from the old country and desire to go back somehow?
Could you repeat the beginning of the first question?
Yeah, for you, I guess personally or professionally, why is it important to challenge American Jewish nostalgia?
Got it. Thank you. It's an interesting question. I mean, I think in a broader way, this for me kind of goes beyond just American Jewish nostalgia. The American Jewish bit just happens to be the subject matter in this course, but I think I'm committed to the idea more broadly as well. I guess I'll just kind of a quick answer. I was one of my graduate advisors, Svetlana Boyum, wrote this wonderful book called The Future of Nostalgia about 20 years ago. And she makes this really critical distinction between two kinds of nostalgia. One that emphasizes the desire to rebuild something that was lost, and that desire is imagining all kinds of mythology about things that never really existed. It imagines an idyllic past that somebody could, in the present, try to actively recreate, even though it never existed. And that kind of nostalgia is dangerous. It's associated with nationalisms, for example. It's associated with, make America great again kinds of variety of thinking, where we imagine some sort of past that we think to have been idyllic, and we're trying to actively recreate it hurting other people in the process. So that's the kind of negative nostalgia. And there's another kind of nostalgia that Svetlana Boym talks about. She talks the reflective nostalgia, where you could channel your longing into a kind of creative energy about thinking about the past in a way that is really between, you and your thoughts. You channel that into poetry and prose and, creating art where, all of us long for some kind of past that we imagine, but we can't impose it on other people by trying to somehow replicate it. So to me, that's like it's a really important motivation in anything that I teach, and kind of a lot of things that I think about how, if we're talking about works of art, film, literature, protagonists who, by attempting to enact a fantasy about an idyllic past on others, end up, disturbing their communities in the present, disturbing their, fellow human beings, hurting them by trying to do something that never really existed in the past. So that's, I think, kind of a strong motivation for me, whether it comes to Jewish American material or any other kind of material. And as far as, things to read, there's a lot. I mean, I'm happy to do a kind of follow-up with a reading list. Just, I guess, off the top of my head, if you want this, philosophical approach, I really recommend the book that I mentioned, Svetlana Boym, The Future of Nostalgia. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. From the works that I teach in this course, in the American Jewish Literature course. So, for example, I kind of end the course with the Coen Brothers film, A Serious Man, which, is wonderful. That begins with a fantasy about a shtetl, a fantasy about the old country. There's a kind of a short film in the beginning of it in Yiddish, and we don't know what to make of it and how it relates to the rest of the film, which is set in Minneapolis in the 1960s. But there's something that the key protagonist of the film, comes back to. He keeps listening to a record in Yiddish at moments when he kind of enters these moments of stress. And I'm not really sure if he's understanding Yiddish or he's listening to it because it recalls his own childhood somewhere in a more kind of cohesive traditional Jewish community. But in some ways, it evokes the dysfunction in the shtetl itself that's shown in the beginning of the film, which is a place in A Serious Man where all kinds of strange, unresolved, problematic, conflicted things are kept, and never, like in a Pandora's box. And I never fully explored, never fully analyzed, that maybe continue to haunt subsequent generation of people who no longer live in the old country, who've carried it with them somehow. So I guess I'm struck in Moyshe-Leyb Halpern's poem by the very provocative resistance to be haunted by that kind of unresolved past, by, confronting it instead head on, killing off nostalgia so as to maybe be able to have some kind of a possibility of facing the present.
Really wonderfully put. Thank you, Sasha.
Thank you.
I'm sorry that we don't have more time. I know there were some great questions here. I would encourage all of our student attendees to look into Sasha's fall courses. And yes,
if you like.
If you'd like to contact Sasha directly, senderov@uw.edu. If you want to get in touch with the program, jewishst@uw.edu. And I'm putting both of those in the chat now. Hopefully everyone can see that. And with that, we'll wrap up. Thank you all for coming. Hope to see you again at the rest of this series. possibly also the Stroum lecture presentation, and just a reminder about UW Counseling Center resources. Anything else to add, Sasha?
No, thank you very much. And it's again, thank you for being here. It's very strange for me to not see faces or not to hear the audience. But I hope that this was worth it for you.
Yes, definitely a new format to adjust to, and we're so grateful to everyone and to you for sharing. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.